everyone, welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be taking it back and doing the thing with the MISTI that it's best known for, and that is making multiples so quick and easy. I'm going to be doing some Bible markers or bookmarks today. Either way you want to say it works. I am starting off with some white cardstock, and I have two different sizes here. These are all 5.5 inches long. But the smaller one is 2 inches, and then I have a 2 1/4 inch wide that is also 5.5 inches long that I'll be using as a mat. I'm doing two different projects today, and each one I'm doing multiples of. So I'm going to end up with 7 different bookmarks here, and throughout this entire video I have a ton of different techniques and different things to show you using the MISTI. So I understand this is a longer video, but I promise it's not going to be repetitive. I've got a ton of different things to show you. So I'm starting off with this Praise the Lord stamp set from Joy Clair. This is from their Color by Face series. If you aren't familiar with Joy Clair has two different lines of stamps. They have their Everyday collection and they have the Color by Face series. The Everyday collection is just what it sounds like. It's great for your everyday cards, happy birthday, new baby, thank you cards, but they also have a great line called Color by Faith. Now these are a faith-based stamp and they are great for Bible journaling, but I happen to use them not only on Bible journaling but also on card projects and like you see here on bookmarks or Bible markers. So they're very versatile even though they are made for like your Bible journaling or art journaling. Now I'm starting off with that Praise the Lord stamp set. I have loaded it onto my MISTI. Now for this particular bookmark, I am using my MISTI corners, creative corners, up in the top right hand side. That's going to bump my little panel away from the right hand edge, also from the top, but I'm not worried about that so much. It was mostly that right hand edge because I don't want my stamp bumping up against there. Now I am stamping this silhouette stamp down on the bottom of this bookmark, and I'm using VersaFine Onyx black ink. Now this is a pigment ink and this is messy, but this is my favorite way to do black embossing, and I want to do an emboss resist technique later on, so that's why I'm putting this type of ink down. So to make this even more in-depth, I'm going to go ahead and heat emboss this with clear embossing powder. Now this is just my favorite way to do black embossing. I also did prep my surface with my embossing bag. If you don't like to do black embossing this way, you can always use black embossing powder. It works exactly the same way. It just gives you a little bit of a different look. I went ahead and sprinkled on my clear embossing powder. Now one tip to make embossing very quick and easy when you're doing multiples is to use a coffee filter underneath, and that catches your extra embossing powder. You don't have to go back and put it back in the jar every single time because it has those sides on it. Just set it off to the side and keep pulling it back in, and you'll see what I mean by that later on as I go and do more of these. Whenever I'm doing heat embossing, I like to let my heat gun heat up for a good 15 seconds and then I bring it to my paper. I'll be adding water over this later on, so I really want to cut down on warping now because I'll have some more later on. I went ahead and heat set that with my heat tool, and now I'm going to go on and stamp a few more of these. With that creative corner up in the right hand side, I know each and every time I put in this bookmark, I'm going to get the perfect stamped image exactly where I need it every time. That's the great thing about the creative corners. This piece alone is worth it to me. It just bumps away your cardstock from the edge whenever you need that little bit of extra space. Now before I was using this piece, I was trying to mark it out with a pencil. I'd put 2 little tick marks in the top left hand corner and the bottom right, and then I would try to line it up, and it wouldn't ever work out for me. I guess I'm just not that talented to put my marks where they need to be. So this saves me a lot of time and effort, especially when I'm stamping like this right on the edge of something. I also love pattern stamping, so this is really going to help with that. I went ahead and sprinkled on my clear embossing powder for this second one, and I'll go ahead and heat set that. Now the great thing about when you're doing multiples, I am heat setting mine each as I get done with them. Because I work in such a small space, I bump into things a lot. So if I bump into this, it's going to make a mess with that ink, and it's also going to knock off my embossing powder. If you work in a larger space, just sit them off to the side and you can go and heat emboss them all at one time. That'll save you time. I just unfortunately work in a small space, so it's not possible for me to do that. I'm moving on to my third one, again inking this up, and each one I am at least double stamping. This is a very solid stamp, so I need to get really maximum coverage with it to get the best image. That's where this Misty comes in. I can stamp it once, flip it back open, ink it up, stamp it down again, and each and every time I know it's going to line up perfectly. I'm on my fourth and final one for this design. I'll go ahead and ink this up with my VersaFine and stamp this right down. I'm prepping each time with my embossing bag right on the bottom of that panel. That's just going to help with stray embossing powder. Now the total time for the stamping and heat embossing for this set was 6 minutes. That's all it took to make 4 of these. So just, if you need to make more, go ahead and use that number and you can kind of figure out how long it's going to take you. And also, because I had to heat emboss each one separately because of my small workspace, you could save even extra time there. Now in this stamp set, there are a ton of different sentiments and I love them. They're this great, really graphic type that you can go in and color. To make these work, I'm going to go ahead and move my bookmark down to the bottom, and I've moved my creative corner down to the bottom as well. That's going to help me line up these sentiments on the top. Now again, each one I am doing a different sentiment, so this is going to take me a little bit longer. If you need to cut down on time and you need to make a bunch of these the night before, you can just use this same exact sentiment all the way across and it's going to go really quickly. I went ahead and loaded that up, made sure I looked through to make sure everything was straight and even on both sides. I like to use the grid marks on the front of the Misty to help me with that. And that just makes sure that I can get things placed straight. I don't know if my eyes are crooked or what, but I cannot put anything down straight. If my husband's hanging a mirror or something for me, he asks, is it straight? And I'm like, you need to go get a level, because if I say it's straight, we know it's not going to be straight. So I just have to look through and really use those lines to my advantage and help me line everything up perfectly. Now on that one, I went ahead and stamped the Give God Crazy Praise, and then on this one, I'm stamping Praise the Lord. Now these are really blocks, letters that are in here, and they've got some doodling on them, which is a whole lot of fun to color. I'm going to color these in all one color later on, but these would be so fun to do in like a rainbow color with a black sort of, with the black shadows on them. That would be awesome. Now on this one, I'm going to go ahead and stamp Make a Joyful Noise. Again, I'm using that same VersaFine Onyx Black ink, and I am heat embossing these with the clear embossing powder. I'm just not showing each and every time I do that. Like I said before, the VersaFine Onyx Black ink is a pigment ink, and it gets a little messy. So I have a few splotches here and there. You can see it mostly on this one. Ink gets on my fingers. The Misty does cut down on that, but I'm just a messy person in general, so it's bound to happen with this ink. To get that off and make sure I don't have to restart this card or this project all over again, I like to do a few different things. The first thing I do is I take my sanding block and I get off whatever I can. If you have some that's deeper into your cardstock, especially with like dye ink, I had the advantage here of pigment ink really sits on top of the paper. It doesn't soak in so much. So this, I could use my sanding block and just really work away that top layer of paper. And that worked for me. If you have a dye ink that you're using and it goes a little bit deeper into the paper, start off with a craft knife. Really kind of just go over the place where you've got your ink, scratch at it with the tip of your craft knife, then come in with your sanding block, and then come in with an eraser. So you're basically sanding your paper. You're starting with your toughest grit and going down to your lightest so you end up with a smooth surface. That has really helped me think about, you know, getting rid of those ink splotches. So thinking about it that way might help you too. Now before I go on and finish that set of Bible markers that I have made. I'm going to start on my second one while I have all of my stamping stuff out. For this one, I am using this stamp set from Joy Clair. Again, it's from their Color by Face series. It's called Chain Breaker. Again, this one is meant for Bible journaling or that type of thing. I'm going to be using it to make bookmarks today. It has this great chain image in it, and it also has these little pieces that look like, if you break something apart, you don't have always a perfect break. You've got little pieces that kind of splinter off. That's what those little kind of shards are, I guess you could say. I went ahead and lined up the chain so it's kind of offset from each other, and then I put in those little pieces that look like they're flying off from a breaking chain right next to each, kind of the top of the one that's broken on the bottom and the bottom of the one that's broken on the top. I went ahead and lined those up. Again, I'm using that creative corner in the top right hand corner, and because I am using so many stamps on this one to create kind of this one focal point, the Misty is a lifesaver here. I can line these all up, so I've got 4 different stamps all being stamped at one time. I don't have to go and stamp each one individually. If I was doing this with a regular acrylic block, I would have to go in first with that bottom one, make sure everything's lined up perfectly, stamp that down. If I don't get a good stamp, I'd have to start over. Then I can go ahead and stamp my top one. I have to make sure that's lined up right with a big design like this, and then I have to go in and stamp each one of those little shards. I'm doing 3 of these, but if you need more of these, that's going to take a while. Being able to stamp all of these 4 stamps at once saves me so much time. And I do this all the time, stamping multiple stamps at one time. I do want to go back in and give it a double stamping, but even adding in that extra step, I'm still saving tons of time with this one. I'm stamping these down with Memento Tuxedo Black ink because I'll be coloring these in with alcohol markers. Now, if that is too much work for a design like this and you want to color these in with, you can use watercolors, you could leave them blank. You could always go in and do stamp these on gray, and then you could cut them out with your electronic cutting machine. The great thing about Joy Clair is anytime you buy one of their stamp sets, automatically, just with any stamp set they have, you get the free download for the cut files for your electronic cutting machine. So you don't need to go and buy anything extra to make it work. You automatically get that download when you buy one of their stamp sets. And the same goes for this one. If you want to go ahead and get the cut files, they download with the stamp, and then you can cut these out with your electronic cutting machine, and that'll save time. The total stamping time for this was 3.5 minutes, and that is with 3 different bookmarks that I'm doing. So in total, each one took just a little bit over a minute. That is not bad, and that's with lining them up, inking up the stamp, and double stamping it each and every time. For that particular one that I just did, the Chain Breaker bookmark, I'm going to go ahead and stamp out my sentiments while I have my Misty out. And I am using the I Am Set Free sentiment from that Chain Breaker stamp set. I'll be stamping it on black cardstock. Now, if I were to line this up with the bottom of my Misty without that creative corner, I wouldn't be able to get that I Am Set Free, the bottom of the sentiment, I wouldn't be able to get that bumped up at the very bottom because it's going to get in the way of the bottom of the tool. And that would give me a little bit harder time. I could make it work, but the creative corner just makes it so much easier stamping this down. I don't have to worry about giving it a harder press on the bottom to make sure I get the bottom of those letters stamped really well. I stamped them in Versamark ink. I did prep my surface, and I'm going to be heat embossing these in white embossing powder. Again, I'm using that coffee filter trick just to save me time so I don't have to clean up my mess each and every time. If you're like me and you're clumsy and you bump things on a regular basis, you know what I'm talking about. If you have ever bumped over an embossing powder on your work surface, then the whole project has to stop, the vacuum cleaner has to come out, and it just ends up a mess. So that really saves me in the long run. To color these in, I am using my alcohol markers. I don't have a darker gray than what I have here, so what I did was I actually took a purple, it's like a violet, and I'm using that as my shadow. anything with like a gray undertone, especially your purples, that will really work when you need to shadow out your grays. I'm coloring in those chains super quick. I just put down shadow and then go over each and every one with that darker alcohol marker that's gray. And it's that easy, quick and simple, nothing fancy here. But like I said, if you have to make a lot of these, you can always stamp on gray cardstock. And then you can use those cut files to cut these out if you have an electronic cutting machine. And that will save you a lot of time. If you don't even want to do that, you could always leave them blank. It would still be a beautiful design just with them being white. I went ahead and put in the shadows on this last one, and then I'm coloring it in. I gave it just a little bit of time to set into the paper, so not all of it blended out completely. And then I'll come in with my darker gray and color over that very quickly, and it still keeps some of the shadow in. With this design, if you aren't a fan of alcohol markers or you don't have them, you can always color this in with any type of watercolor marker, colored pencils. You can even make masks for these and color them in with distress inks or any other kind of gray ink you might have on hand. Pigment ink works really well for that technique. It's really up to you. Now, for the first set of Bible markers that I made, I promised I would throw in some more techniques, so here is one. I'm going to be making a watercolor background with this. The first thing I want to do is I've got a plastic mat down behind my Bible marker to catch any little extra water and color that's coming off the side. I went ahead and got my palette out. I've got some picked raspberry and peacock feathers, distress ink on there, and then I gave them a squirt with some clean water. I just gave them a very gentle spraying. I've got my brayer out. I'm going to go ahead and run this through my two colors, kind of just shimming back and forth very little bit just to get them blending right in the center, and that's going to make a beautiful purple. I'll bring my brayer over to my paper, and I am just going to roll this right over the top. That's going to create this very splotchy watercolor background that's very faint. You can build up the color with more layers, but I really love the soft look on the background. I am doing this on regular cardstock too. I should have said that in the beginning. I am stamping on plain cardstock with both of these, and I am doing my watercolor on plain cardstock. That allows for the color to immediately soak in, retain its vibrancy, and it doesn't move around a whole lot. If you want that more soft look and you want the colors to kind of mix and everything on the cardstock, use a watercolor paper. I just happen to like the look of it on plain cardstock, but that's just me. With that being said, you are going to get more warping, but with just a little bit extra adhesive on the back, it's not that big of a deal. Now on my next one, I'm going to go ahead and do the exact same technique. I cleaned my palette off. I put on some squeezed lemonade and twisted citron, ran my brayer through there after I gave it some sprays of water. I'm picking up the color, giving it a little bit of time to mix in the middle, and then I just roll it onto the paper, and it creates this gorgeous ombre look that's watercolor, but at the same time, it doesn't necessarily look like watercolor. It almost looks like an ink background. On my next one, I'm using seedless preserves and spice marmalade. I put them down on my palette, spraying them with water, and I'm just mixing them a little bit. Now with this, you want to make sure that you mix colors that aren't going to turn to mud. The first one I did, I didn't actually do it on a bookmark, but I just tried this technique on a scrap piece of paper, and it completely turned into mud. I tried to use like 3 different colors, and it didn't work out. So if you want to be brave and you've got a bigger brayer than I do and you want to use more colors, by all means go for it and play around with this technique. For me, it didn't work out with my small brayer, but it might work for you. My next colors, I'm using Twisted Citron and Cracked Pistachio. I'm doing this a little bit different. I've turned my palette horizontally. I put those on and kind of mixed them in the middle already. I'm spraying this with some water, and I'll go ahead and spray my cardstock as well. That's going to give it a little bit more time to move before it soaks into the paper. This one I'm going in horizontally across the paper, so I'll actually get 4 different stripes, and I'm just placing down that color. Again, this is very light the first pass, but you can always go in and build this up if you feel like you don't have enough color or you want it a little bit more intense. You can also wait for it to dry in between layers and go back in, and that's going to give you a really intense color as well. I didn't do it on any of these, but I did try it out and that will work. Now to color in each one of these sentiments, like I said before, this would be gorgeous in rainbow to do these, but for mine, I want them to stand out from the background, so I'm going in with black. I have put some black watercolor marker. You can use black soot distress ink, whatever you want. I've smushed that onto my palette, and then I'm using a water brush to quickly color in each one of these little letters that are kind of like the block letter look. And this is just a very quick way to get them colored in. If you wanted to, you could always go in with alcohol markers or something like that. I wanted a little bit more of a messy look on these. That's why I went with watercolor. But if you wanted very dark, saturated color, use an alcohol marker. That finishes that part off, and now it's time to start putting these all together. When I started this video, I showed you 2 sets of white cardstock that I had. I had one that was 2 inches wide and one set that was 2 1/4 inches wide. That 2 1/4 is going to be my matte, especially on the alcohol markers one where you see the color bleed through on the back. I wanted to add that matte. It's also going to help whenever you go and adhere the watercolor pieces on. It's going to help with the warping on those. To make these a little bit more interesting and stand out, I'm adding some stitching detail along each one of the edges. You can totally skip this part, but I happen to like the look of it, so I'm going to go ahead and do it on each one. To make this a little bit quicker, I have the Lawn Fawn Stetta stitching. You can get stitching dies from a lot of different places, and each one of these die sets has multiple dies in it. The majority of them do. I like to use the different dies that are in this set, and then I can run each one through, or I can run 2 at a time through. If you wanted to turn these horizontally and run them through, you could probably fit 4 in and use each one of the 4 dies in this set, and that would take no time at all. I put stitching on both sides of those, very quick and easy to do, and then it was time to start really putting these together. On the chain breaker ones, on the chain breaker bookmarks that I made, I'm going to go ahead and put on the sentiments. I'm putting them on at an angle, and that's just going to give them a little bit more interest since everything is sort of gray and white and black. It's just going to add a little bit something extra that really makes these bookmarks pop. On the back of them, I'm using some multimedia matte. You can use whatever kind of adhesive you want. I just like a liquid adhesive. I've got that little bit of playtime. I went ahead and placed that down at an angle, and then I'll place an acrylic block right on top and let those dry. I used my scissors to cut the sides flush, and then I adhered some adhesive right on the back of them. For this, I am using score tape, a paper adhesive that's really strong. That's going to hold these together and make sure nothing moves and falls apart. Because bookmarks are handled so much, moved around, kind of just put through the ringer, I like to use extra strong adhesive when I make anything like this because I don't want them to fall apart. If you wanted to go even a step further, you could put these through your laminator, and that would make them stay together even better, and then they will be kind of indestructible, not really indestructible, but they'll last a little bit longer. So I am just applying that to both sides of my little bookmark here, the front panel. I'll pull off the backing paper and then center it in between those 2 stitch marks. Now this is one of the watercolor markers that I have, and even just with the 2 pieces, it really helps secure that down, and I didn't have any problems with warping or with the cardstock wanting to pull away. So I did that on each and every one, and then on my watercolor bookmarks, I went ahead and just popped a hole punch right in the center of the top of each one of those. But on my other ones, I did it a little bit differently. For each one, I did thread through baker's twine. There's a look at the watercolor bookmarks all ready to go. I threaded 2 pieces of baker's twine, and so it looks like 4 up at the top. And then on my other ones, I did it on the right hand top corner because I didn't want to stamp into any of my little change there. So I just did those a little bit differently, but I kept the same black and white baker's twine, 2 strands threaded to look like 4 strands, and that finished off those. These were all so easy to do, and because I used the MISTI, the creative corners with my Joy Clair stamps, these didn't take any time at all. I want to thank you guys so much for watching today, especially if you made it to the end. There are some links on the left side of your screen you can click on. Happy crafting, everyone.